I'm Luke Fretwell, and this is the GovFresh podcast. In her book, Hack to the Future, How World Governments Relentlessly Pursue and Domesticate Hackers, Emily Crose offers a cultural, historical, and legal schooling on government's approach to hackers and hacking. The relationship between hackers and the government has evolved over the decades, from combative to somewhat congenial, but it's continuously complicated. In this episode, Emily and I discuss the evolution of hacking and how governments can better work with hackers, particularly in recruiting them for public service. My big takeaway from talking with Emily is that hacking is not about just one person or group, but a community built on creativity and joy, of people who are artists who also happen to be technologists. If government can better grok this, we'll have a more symbiotic and productive relationship between the bureaucracy and hackers that better serves us all. It's funny, I found the book. I was looking at my library website and it was featured on the homepage. And I'm like, why haven't I heard of this? And then so I got it and I was just like, this is amazing that you wrote this. And I always like how much I like a book is determined, one, whether I take notes. And I usually take notes on like index cards. So it's like, one, do I take notes? And two, like how many index cards do I use? And these are my index cards.
Oh, wow.
So I've got 7 index cards, but it was awesome. It was, it's nice to I'm a fan of sort of internet history and hacker history, but it was nice to see that you had packaged it up all in one, neat package. So why was that important to you to write this book?
Yeah, I'd been working with a colleague on a project, a side project. After I left government, I kind of took on a lot of little side projects. That was around 2017, 2018 timeframe. So I took on all these little side projects, and one of them was a project that we called Hacking History. It's working with another person who submits freedom of information requests to the government. So I was working with them to do that. We're trying to pull together as much information about these old pieces of malware and hackers and events to sort of figure out what the hacking community looked like through the eyes of a governmental, a government employee from decade to decade. So the initial conceit of the book was it's an interesting. The initial conceit was you had this group in the 1970s, this weird little group of tech nerds who spent all their time trying to figure out how the phone system works, and they're always on the fringes until they weren't. And how did they go from being these fringe tech fanatics to being, a lever of government power in the space of 40 years? You don't see that really with through subculture groups like this almost ever. I mean, there weren't pilots, before there were pilots, really. The government started investing in flight almost as soon as flight, was discovered. So there wasn't a huge span of time where the technology existed and the government just didn't take interest in it. But that is sort of the case with phone technology, not as much, but internet technology. And the people that built it took very different tracks. And bringing those hackers into the fold was not something that the government was really well primed to do, especially in the Cold War.
Yeah.
So I thought that would be an interesting question to explore, and it kind of became more than that. Actually, it also became a question of how did we in the United States and the Western world end up doing this in a way that the global power in the East didn't.
Yeah.
And is that assumption even correct? Was there actually an underground sort of subculture like the phone freakers
Yeah.
in the Soviet Union, and how did they contribute to that environment at that time? And so I spend time in the book talking about that as well.
Yeah. So in the book, you sort of have, I don't know if it's cringe is the right word, but when you talk about hacker or hacking as a term, how do you see that? What do those mean? And like, how do you see those terms, and what do they mean to sort of the generic person who may have kind of as hacker is bad, and there's all different sort of flavors of hacking, but just be good to understand sort of your perception of the term, and also kind of like what is it? What does hacking and hackers mean? Broadly.
Yeah, that's a question I struggled with when I started writing the book, because I wrote the intro for the book probably 2.5 or 3 years ago at this point, and I'm sitting in a park in Delaware trying to figure out how do I'm going to have to use a term. I
Yeah,
can't just avoid using a
yeah,
word to sort of generalize this community. So what do I use? Do I say hacker, or do I say, you know, uh, uh, technical people, or like
yeah,
what's the best term to use there? And it was a bit of a struggle for me to figure out what made the most sense at the time. So I landed on hacker as a broader term,
mm,
which I think is probably closer to the taste of a lot of people who have been critical, including myself, over the years, um, to describe like a somebody who's just involved with technology, the development of radio, and
mhm,
the story of Neville Maskelyne, and how he had the same sort of back and forth with Marconi that we would like. You could transplant that story to 10 years ago,
mhm.
and it feels very much like a story that would have come out of a message board, like a something awful type forum type of like
Yeah,
feud that happened. So you see these contour. I use the word contours through history a lot, so I'll probably say this again, but you see that contour early on, and I brought up that story to say this is the type of hacker I'm talking about. Like,
yeah,
this person is not necessarily breaking computers, because they didn't exist at the time in the same
yeah,
way that we understand them today. But we're talking more about an ethos. We're talking more about a mindset, a thought process when I use that term. So I thought that worked well. It didn't feel as cringe as the book went on.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's funny that you say that because I guess I've just become so used to saying it that um, it doesn't bother me. I think that more, when I say it, sometimes people sort of perceive it not in the way that I perceive it. Whereas I think, oh, you're going to hack around, or just hack at it or whatever. And I think people, perceive it as being something negative, especially when you're talking to government and it's, oh, am I going
Yeah.
to get, ransomware? What do you mean you're going to, like there's this term we use, civic hacking, which is,
Mhm.
I guess, sort of a white hat type of hacking, although not as, professional, but, or professional-ish. And, I think with government, you sort of have to clarify it's civic hacking. So then it kind of makes it, not evil. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I never had really thought about it until you brought it up, and sort of a struggling with what to call it. But it's hard to find another term for it. It's like you can't say, sort of technology people, because that doesn't roll off the tongue. Uh,
Yeah, I think you'll find that you have to, if you don't use the word hacker, you're going to end up with a combination of two words,
yeah.
which I just wasn't going to write that every time.
Yeah, and even sort of the black hat, gray hat, white hat, gets
Yeah.
lost on people. And I liked your comment about sort of the white hat. and the, sort of cowboy hero, is the good guy. And that actually helped me because sometimes I'm like, which one is it again? I
Yeah.
know what the gray is, but is it the black hacker the good, or but that
Yeah.
was actually super helpful. So I appreciate that. One of the things I think, like, there's like these hacker personalities that are out there that we sort of become decent. Hacker is like this generic term, but there's definitely, personalities that have shown up throughout the decades, um, that I think you've talked about throughout the book. But I would love to hear, sort of a few that really stand out to you and why.
Yeah, well, I already mentioned the Neville Maskelyne one. I
Hmm.
thought that was an interesting story because I what is another one of those uh, technical challenges of trying to figure out how to structure a book like this. And when you are asking that question, you have to kind of figure out, like, especially when it's history related, where do you start the timeline and where do you end the timeline?
Yeah.
So I tried to, like, what, like, let me backtrack just a second. Another challenge with writing this book is try I didn't want to write something that was too much like any other history that's been written before.
Yeah.
And I had written a revision of the book where I got up to chapter 4 and I was like, I feel like I'm just rewriting something that somebody else had written some other time.
Yeah.
It's a very bland rehashing of a lot of the same stories that you would read, about, like, any given history of hacking or the hacking community
Hmm.
was reading like the first 4 chapters of the original draft that I'd written. So I tried to go back to a different place mentally. Like, how do uh, if I can draw a line from somebody historic that that demonstrates that this idea of a hacker is not necessarily a new thing in the way that we think that it is.
Hmm.
Because a lot of these histories will start around the 1970s. You might get one in the 1950s if you have somebody who dug deeper on, the way that the government had developed computers in the post-war era. So I tried to find a story that linked the same type of person. Like, they had this, the kids would say, I have the same aura
Hmm.
as a hacker today, but was 150 years ago, or 125 years ago, or however long back. And so that story I thought was an important one to tell. And I'm still really glad that I started with that one because it helps to broaden the idea of what we think of when we discuss hackers. But yeah, that's one of the ones that I really like in the book.
Yeah.
Even though it is the first example, it's kind of like the easiest one I can point to.
Yeah. I think that, like, as someone who has kind of, read some of the deeper books on hacking, um, the uh, Cliff Stoll book, the Cuckoo's Egg.
Yeah,
Um, I think that is, it's just it's such a great story.
yeah,
And I think that, like, because I think for him, he was curious and it was funny and it wasn't, it was just sort of a great cat and mouse story. um, and he actually lives not too far from us. And what's funny is I was like, what is he doing now? And apparently he's like making these sort of Klein bottles, which I'm not smart enough to understand what they do. But they're these glass sort of bottle, and makes them at his house. And he has, if you want to come over and check them out, you can check them out. Email me. And I emailed him and I said, hey, I loved the book. I loved your TED talk. I'm just curious, and within like 15 minutes, he responded back and said, can you follow back up with me in June? And, we can meet up. So, um, that was kind of a hilarious sort of response I wasn't expecting, but maybe we'll end up
yeah.
meeting Cliff sometime in June.
Yeah,
Um,
that's cool. I like that. That is a one of the iconic stories. Obviously, I don't want to tell that one too much in my book because Cliff already had done such a great job of telling that story. But there's an interesting addendum to that one that I wish I would have been able to follow up on a little bit better, which is the story of think his name was Carl Koch, who's one of the hackers in that story, a German guy, and his death was so
Yeah.
weird.
Yeah.
And would have hoped that at this point we would have more information about that whole situation. I think there's. I try not to be too conspiratorial because I think that's a little. I think it's very old hat now to be conspiracy minded like that. But I just think it's a very interesting end to that whole story.
Yeah.
As somebody who had this sort of trouble ended up, his body was burned, his shoes were
Yeah.
taken off, nothing around the vehicle was really burned. And just a lot of weird questions I think still remain about that story. But I think that's kind of what you get with hackers over the years, especially in the era before what I what I what I call hacker rehabilitation in the book.
Yeah.
Before companies started looking for hackers and seeking them out for recruitment, you had a lot of stories that had interesting twists and turns in the way that that story did. And another one of my, I hadn't asked the question yet, but just kind of going back to the last question, I guess. Another one of the hacker stories from the book that I really like, I'd found through some other sources as well, is a guy named Stafford Beer who he worked in industrial applications for computers back in the 1960s. Like, we think of the term cybernetics as kind of a weird generalization now, but it actually had a very specific application in those days, a very specific connotation with regards to the convergence of technology and you know biology. And so the story of him going down to help the Allende government in the 1970s is a really interesting story that I just didn't know going into this book. There's some other really good sources on that story that I used for this one as well, including how not to build the internet, or how not to build. I'll have to look up the specific term, the specific title of it, but it was also a really good book that told the entire story rather than just like a distilled version that I
Yeah.
have in my book. But a really, really interesting story of a government trying to build the internet in much the same way that the United States did, but then also having their efforts undermined by the United States
Yeah.
for political reasons. I thought was a really interesting story to tell.
Yeah. So, more broadly, from the individual, there's a number of sort of hacker groups that have, you know, become popular, or at least, popular amongst the tech crowd. We have like Anonymous, of course, Cult of the Dead Cow. Is it Loft? Is that how you say it?
Yep.
Loft. Um, what are the groups, that are out there, whether past or current? I don't even know if there are any more current. Maybe there are. Um, but what are these sort of groups, these hacker groups, and how do they differ in how they operate?
That's a question that I think you have to answer uh, generationally, because the groups that you tend to see now are not the groups that you would have seen 30 years ago or even really 15 years ago. They've changed so much over time, from the very old groups of phone freakers in the 1970s to the groups that you tend to see more now, which are financially driven, a lot of them.
Mm,
So that changed. The most recent iteration, I think, happened probably around the 2015 timeframe,
hmm.
somewhere in there, 2014, 2015, which is about the place where I end the book.
Okay.
And so if I were going to write like a part two to this book, I would probably try to focus on those types of groups, these independent groups that it would be hard to write a book about those groups today, because they aren't nearly as vocal about what they're doing as groups 15 years ago or 20 years ago would have been.
Yeah.
So the golden age in the 2010s, of the post 2000s sort of golden age of hackers, were using Twitter all the time and
Yeah.
talking about what they were doing. And you don't see a lot of groups anymore that are really verbose about that. doing it for non-financial reasons
Right.
as much as he used to. And there are still some, obviously, but your ransomware groups are all very focused on making money, and they are making a lot of money. So you can almost track that arc of the introduction of money to this entire enterprise of breaking computers. You can track that from recruiting and hiring to independent groups, making money off of the same sort of idea.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of questions I would have about how that operates today, but I do think that's an interesting evolution.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that and how they're, less quiet, more financially oriented, whereas, early on or earlier, like the cult of the dead cow, it seemed like they were much more focused on exposing issues and, you know, trying to for for improvement purposes, not for nefarious purposes, maybe to some degree, but and then, like Anonymous sort of was vocal, but questionable on, their motives, or their political stance. And even, I don't know if you would consider WikiLeaks a hacker group, but, just sort of focused on a different approach. But the, evolving into kind of what post 2015, and really thought about that, they're much more, most of the hacking community or hacker groups are, you know, much more business minded and have a financial a strategy.
Yeah, well, that actually is sort of interesting confluence with what I track in the book, because the subtext to the stories that I tell, or the I guess the thing that binds the entire timeline together, is this idea that you hackers used to have, I think, a better sense of humor. There was more art involved in
Mm,
what we did. And so when you introduce the idea of money, there's a sort of professionalism that sort of
yeah,
creeps in, and and I think that it sort of waters the experience down a
yeah,
little bit. It doesn't seem as fun anymore. It feels like work now. So
yeah. That's a good
it's
point.
unfortunate.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think that's why I loved the I can't remember who wrote it, but the history of Cult of the Dead Cow. It just definitely felt like there was a sense of joy underlying all of the work. And
Yeah,
you start reading books after kind of that, and it's definitely a little bit more dark.
yeah,
Um, and I think this gets to sort of related to that, you write about how the entertainment industry has influenced sort of awareness around hacking and hackers, through media or through movies, through TV, and also kind of influence sort of public policy or government officials waking up to the fact that there's this thing, that there's this hacking and the potential for it. And we have like war games, hackers, even Ferris Bueller and Mr. Robot, of course. But if you look at those, I guess it's interesting that if you map those out to what you're saying with sort of the evolution of hacking and sort of the beginning, it was fun, and now it's more serious and dark. You could almost map the entertainment related to that in the same way, where it was um, Ferris Bueller hacking into his school computer to get an A, or you know eliminate his absences. And then hackers was a little like a blend. It felt sort of, there was like this joy with that group of people, or sense of camaraderie and purpose. Um, and then you get to like Mr. Robot, and it's like completely dark, and So what has the entertainment industry's influence been on kind of hacking and the perception that folks have, both generally, and I know that you mentioned in the book that after, uh, was it Ferris Bueller, that somebody in Department of Defense or somebody was like, "Is this possible?" And then
Oh
the
yeah,
answer was, "Yes, it is." So, what is
yeah.
the influence the entertainment industry has had on kind of public perception of technical people? Right? I don't even know if they were calling it hackers then, but maybe. But also government. Real sort of seriousness of like, we need to start paying attention to this.
Yeah, it definitely mattered more in the 1980s and early 1990s, I think, than it really even does now. I think the public has a better idea of what a hacker is now, just
Yeah.
from the experience that we have with technology being as pervasive as it is these days. But back in the 80s, it's hard to understate how much a movie like, I think you were talking about War Games, the one that really had a heavy influence on the way that the government understood its own computer systems, computer networks, for things like nuclear control, command and control,
Yeah.
and how that sort of had a confluence into the news that was happening at the time. It is hard to it's hard to understate how impactful that was when nobody knew what a hacker was.
Yeah.
So defining this group happened in those early days in the 1980s when nobody knew what a hacker was, and it changed in the 1990s. I think hackers was a really important piece of media that happened in 1992 or 1993. That I kind of mentioned this in the book, but the importance of that was not just in defining hackers to the public with hackers. It was the importance of that one to me is that it actually helped define hackers to themselves.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
I was trying to think when I started writing the book, how do I make a comparison of like can I tell a story of life imitating art and then vice versa,
Yeah.
and or strike that and reverse it. The idea that hackers were defining the way that hackers looked before the movie Hackers,
Hmm.
and then after the movie Hackers came out, you started to see, I think, like the new generation of people coming into the community had a somewhat different attitude about themselves. Like we felt cooler, we looked cooler. This
Yeah.
idea that you could be like a sexy hacker was something
Yeah.
that I don't think anybody really conceived of before that. But then after Hackers, that was fully a part of the scene for a very long time. And now I think everyone just wears a suit and a tie. Doesn't really, yeah. So goes the degradation of the humor, But that was a fun time to
That's funny.
observe.
Yeah. Well, and I know you talk about kind of identity and gender, and as part of that, in reference to, was it War Game? Was it Hackers? It was Hackers, and you
Yeah,
talk about how the characters in that particular movie um, definitely countered sort of the white male hoodie, that the narrative that we hear about, which it was that in the 80s. I mean, it was, and that was almost ahead of its time.
oh
So it
yeah.
was,
Well, I think we still have that. I think we still have that to a certain extent. That there's this assumption that all hackers are one type, and I think anybody who's been to a conference knows that that's not true. And I tried not to lay that on too thick, because you can read a lot of books about individuals who don't fall squarely into that
mhm,
one stereotype
yeah.
for any given thing. But the story of like Susie Thunder comes to mind when
Hmm.
am asked this question, and she was a phone phreaker who made that jump between phone phreaking and hacking in the early 1980s, and she was right in the thick of it with some of the best of them. Like
Yeah.
she was very much a part of the Kevin Mitnick story, and especially in the early days, someone who just dropped off the map, at a certain point. But yeah, it's unfortunate that we have lost those stories, but I think everyone who's involved in the scene, I think, understands that dynamic exists.
Yeah.
So I didn't want to completely not write anything about that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important, right? And you talk about it in the book, there are women who have played a role in hacking that sort of, it hasn't been acknowledged as much. And I know like Grace Hopper, there's the women who are managing the phone lines, early on when the telephone, um, and they were the operators, um, and it definitely, I can't, and I think like I've never been to a sort of a hacker conference, but I'm on the DEF CON Discord, so you definitely see there's like, it's varied, and I'm curious to hear what you have to say about it's kind of moved towards suits. But who are the women who you feel like have played key roles, whether it's a specific person, or generally, like with the phone operators who have played a role that has sort of been undervalued or undercovered?
Yeah. I kind of I have to be really careful with this question because a lot of those stories have been told in better ways than I could tell them. You
Mm,
mentioned Grace Hopper as another one. I mean, phenomenal individual. And I mentioned Susie Thunder just a minute ago, but they're the most important, if we're talking women, and I think this includes also people of color, uh,
yeah.
the most important people who define these eras, I think, are the people around us. And I didn't want to write a book just about one specific person or a few isolated people. Like this book is really meant to be a reflection of a community.
Hmm.
And we have a tendency, I think, to fall into this idea that rock stars define everything,
Right.
and I think that does a disservice ultimately. If we just have a short list of women who have been in tech over the years. And of course, I think we should know some names. But if we spend too much time making a big deal about a few of them, we kind of lose sight of the people around us
Yeah, that's fair.
in a weird way. And we kind of we make it feel like we have to try too hard to promote people who are really doing the exact same thing as everybody else.
Yeah.
Like I don't want this book to be seen as a promoting one specific um, you know subgenre of hacker.
Yeah.
This community has always defined itself for the most part, except for when we've been defined by the media
Yeah.
in ways that I try to combat a little bit in the book, but um, we're all working in the same way toward a lot of the same goals.
Yeah.
And I think if we start singling people out, it almost waters down the experience a little bit to make it seem like, well, we've underserved one specific group. We should definitely talk about that group, I think. But you
Yeah.
don't want to spend all your time thinking about this group because we're all we I think we lose track of what binds us together as hackers.
Yeah.
That's not to say that they aren't important. I think everybody does phenomenal work. And if I lose track of the fact that the most impactful women and people of color who are hackers to my left and to my right
Yeah.
are the ones who have mattered the most in my journey, and I don't want to say
Yeah.
their names without asking, but
Yeah.
those are the ones who have made the biggest impact on me.
Yeah, that's fair. That's a great answer. So thank you for that. Um, you talked about this at the beginning, the hacker rehabilitation. And it's interesting to me, I think we've seen it to some degree, maybe. And you talk about sort of examples of, you know, hackers doing bad things and government sort of try to, bring them into the fold. Can you talk about what hacker rehabilitation is, and what government's approach has been to it? And I know and like what's great about your book is you're not specific to the US, it's global, and there's different approaches that have been taken.
Rehabilitation is a really interesting concept that doesn't get applied to a whole lot of other areas. Ultimately what it is it's bending and breaking rules so that you can hire somebody who has like a criminal record. And there was definitely a need for that, especially in the early years. I describe it as in the book as a sort of bridge between two generations. The generation of the 1980s and early 1990s, where you have a criminalized group of hackers who, that generation, the biggest names of that generation are arrested or
Hmm.
they find justice one way or another. And the next generation of hackers, which is less overtly criminal, but still dabbling in the gray areas around the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act.
Hmm.
So there had to be a bridge for the government, for the US government at that time, that was starting to realize how deep in it they were,
Yeah.
how behind the times they were with understanding the importance of protecting computer networks.
Hmm.
And that the crucial time period for those individuals was 1996 and 1997, which is when the government started to do, they took on a couple of projects that were crucial in defining our understanding, from the government's perspective, our understanding of how well protected we are. So the two projects that they did in 1997 were, one was called Eligible Receiver. That one
Hmm.
is very well known by people who've been doing this work, cybersecurity work, for decades. And this was kind of another one of those regret moments for me, which was trying to figure out. This was a regret moment for me, and I didn't get as much information about this as I would have liked to, which was a project called Evident Surprise.
Hmm.
I found a reference to this in the eligible receiver documentation, and my request to the Joint Chiefs of Staff is still processing now after, I think, 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
And so, eligible receiver, just briefly, is the project that the government undertook to figure out how well protected we are
Yeah.
from international cybercrime. And evidence surprise is the flip side of that coin. It's the how well can we attack,
Hmm.
and that's the story that hasn't really been told publicly. But there is definitely more to come on that, I think. Maybe in the next 20 or 30 years, maybe
Hmm.
sooner, maybe tomorrow. I mean, they could get back to me tomorrow, and we could totally retell the story of how this whole thing worked, with a lot more detail. But that's kind of the exciting part of doing FOIA work.
Yeah. And so on the hacker rehabilitation, are there examples like how US is differed from sort of France or how they're doing it? Are they still doing it? What's worked, what hasn't worked? I'm just,
Yeah, the one thing that I think everyone can say pretty categorically has worked is getting to these communities early.
Mhm.
So you get a lot of recruitment today that comes from capture the flag uh, uh,
Mhm.
events at conferences throughout
Mhm.
the United States. That's a very easy one. You can talent scout really easily at those types of events because the people who are scoring highest probably have been spending a lot of time doing this sort of thing. So that is definitely a career path for people if you're looking for government work. In years past, these people were still doing all of this. These capture the flag tournaments aren't new. They've been around for a very long time, but they just weren't paid attention to in the same way that they have been probably in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
So that has helped. That has helped get people into the pipeline without generating a commensurate criminal record.
Mhm. Okay. And how you touched on this a little bit, but what would you recommend to government as far as recruiting, technology people, hackers into government work? Because we hear, there's a need for government to have technologists, math, STEM into public service. So what's your recommendation to government, and specifically around how do you recruit?
Yeah. Well, certainly don't fire the hackers. I think that's kind of the big one right now, especially. Don't fire your staff. But for new recruitment, like there's another part of the book I think I kind of tell the story a little bit. The FBI has had a really hard time recruiting and retaining
Mm.
staff, specifically in STEM. And I actually have heard past FBI directors talk about this directly, where we can't hire anybody who's smoked weed.
Hmm.
We can't pay as well as any of the big tech
Right.
companies can. So that right there is two major limitations the government has.
Yeah.
Um, I keep going back to this, but this community is so unlike so many other um, skill areas that the government needs, that you have to find a way of doing outreach to a group of people that does not at all fit the mold of what you expect a government employee to do and to
Yeah.
be.
Yeah.
So if you're from the government and you're looking to recruit people, you really have to start with that mentality of, hey, let's just loosen up a little bit. Let's lighten
Yeah.
up. Let's have fun. Keep in mind that that is the group of people who you are ultimately trying to recruit.
Yeah.
Is a group of people with a good sense of humor,
Yeah.
who is very skeptical of government work, largely, at least historically has been. So yeah, it's challenging, but there are ways to do it right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's interesting because it's a totally different culture, right? You're talking about um, a bureaucratic culture that there's a lot of, and once you get inside, I mean, I'm sure it varies based on, agency, but once you get inside, there's technical things that you are able to do or can't do inside, like deploy this technology easily because there's, you know, um, FedRAMP or FISMA or whatever that stops you from being a hacker. But also on the flip side, the culture is very much an artist community in the broader sense. And you talk about it in the book with these kind of collectives, these creative collectives with like Ghost Ship, and some of these other ones where, fundamentally it's not just hackers, technical people in a room together. It's technical people and artists, and they're sort of blended together. So there's that sense of being an artist. So when you have your recruiting mindset is like, how do we get people into this institution? And we've got to, recruit them with that mindset. And then you think about sort of a creative collective, and it's just like two different worlds. So it's interesting what you say about, you know, letting your hair down, be more fun. Do you feel like that's happening? Do you feel like government's starting to do a, a job of that, a good job?
This is an opinion that's been shared by other people who I talked to for the book. But yeah, I think that they definitely started down that pathway,
Hmm.
or at least the FBI did when they started to better understand what they should and shouldn't pursue
Hmm.
um,
Yeah.
uh, prosecutorially.
Yeah.
So that built up a lot of goodwill that was then almost immediately thrown out the window with other actions that have happened in the government. So that's another one of those contours that I mentioned is the government sort of figures something out with regards to outreach and recruiting, maybe, and then they almost immediately make the situation harder for themselves by going too hard on hackers, or
Yeah.
putting their foot too much on the gas on prosecutions or interpretation of law. And so you have almost like a two steps forward, one step back
Yeah.
sort of event happening over the last maybe 20 years.
Yeah.
I don't really know where we are right now. It's a very weird time
Yeah.
with the relationship, but I don't think it's because the agencies themselves aren't doing a good job. I think the whole government is just generally very much lost its way in lots of different areas.
Yeah. Well, you have some great examples of like, was it Keith Alexander who went to DEF CON and like didn't wear a suit, years ago, which was like the first time that, that happened. And I know that there were spot the Fed.
Yeah.
And it was kind of fun. It started to be fun, and then it wasn't, and then it was, or I don't, it kind of varied because of, like you said, something happened and it wasn't fun anymore. It was,
Yeah.
um, but it definitely seems like, with the voting village and DEF CON, and I keep coming back to DEF CON because that's like my, you know, only reference to sort of the deeper hacker. But it seems, and I kind of pay attention to what comes out of there, but it seems like DEF CON, which is sort of the event, for hackers that's, sort of been around a long time, and is got street cred. It seems like there is some sort of blend between government work and government agencies who are showing up there in not just performative ways. Like, not that that was a performative way, but like not just to give a talk and then leave or whatever.
Yeah.
They're much more entrenched in kind of voter village or
Yeah.
voting village and other ways. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that
Yeah.
sort of helps?
Yeah, we can't have the conversation without me specifically calling out Rob Joyce,
Okay.
who has been, I was pleased to see him casually at the last conference I went to in DC, and he actually came from National Security Agency. I believe
Mhm.
he's retired from government work now, but he gave a talk at ShmooCon this year,
Okay.
back in January, about Christmas lights, doing Christmas light shows, which is something he just has that classic nerd mentality about.
Yeah.
So he worked in the offensive area at National Security Agency, has a fantastic sense of humor as an individual, just a very affable
Hmm.
guy. You can very easily run into him in a hall at one of the conferences, and even when he was working for the government, even before anybody in the public really knew about him, I had been having good interactions with him in the halls at National Security Agency. So he was a major loss when he retired from government service for
Hmm.
this sort of outreach that you're mentioning right now. And really big shoes to fill. His pedigree is, back after Rudy Giuliani, who I think was our first cyber czar,
Hmm.
retired. Rob Joyce stepped into that role, or it may have been the other way around, brought a sort of more serious face to that government position
Hmm.
than I think has ever really. Probably the only really credible one that we've ever
Hmm.
had, if we take that job seriously. So Rob is a fantastic person to have as a representative of government work, but how they're ever going to replace that, I don't know. I mean, maybe there will be another character that comes around who is can fill those shoes, but I think it's going to be hard.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that it is interesting to see, when I saw the stuff coming out of the voting village, there was in like DARPA, like there was some big releases, so it's clear that they're like engaged. So it's nice to see, both from how it impacts how they actually do their work, but also, generally recruit or specifically recruiting, and showing up in a way that's, not as you said, sort of hot, cold, two steps forward, one step
Mm.
back. And I mean, I think with the FBI, and you talk about this in the book, there's a couple of times where they've sort of dropped the ball or missed, just missed didn't read the room, and maybe by the nature of that agency, it's always going to be that way. Whereas with DARPA, it's sort of they can be the fun kids, and you know,
Yeah.
um, generally, when it comes to government and hackers, we talk specifically about recruiting, but generally, when it comes to government and hackers, what's your recommendation to government?
It, it can't it can't go without saying that a large part of this is continuity,
Hmm.
and this is going to be the big problem, I think, in the next probably 10 years, is having people who have that ability to do that sort of outreach, but also are in the scene already.
Yeah.
Um, we I don't know what the exact number is of people who have left government service in the specific area of cyber defense and cyber offense or any other correlated area. But my fear is that it's a lot,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not just hard to replace those people as people. It's hard to replace those people as representatives of legacy knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And when those people are gone, you have to backfill people who have as much of that knowledge as you can possibly get, who can do outreach to communities like this one that are very sensitive to do's and don'ts of things like following the letter of the law. So I kind of worry that maybe in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see old mistakes being made
Mm-hmm.
with regards to how the government, enforces policy on people who work in this area. I mean, I really hope that that's not going to be the case, but a lot of the people who we're talking about right now are people who have learned these lessons the hard way.
Yeah.
Um, and when they're gone, they're gone. So yeah, I don't know what the institutional knowledge even looks like internally anymore.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the GovFresh podcast. To subscribe and hear past episodes, visit podcast.govfresh.com.